Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. This is going to be a fantastic evening. I've been looking forward for this now for a couple of months and planning with the Heavybit team. So thank you to our Heavybit sponsors for supporting us and for providing the venue. All of you, at some point, will hopefully have the opportunity to go through the topic we're going to talk about tonight, which is the transition from founder-led sales. In some cases, it's on the backs of wild success, and the question is, how do we keep growing even faster? In other cases, in many cases, it's in the context of challenges and many of the things that early stage startups are trying to figure out, and they think about bringing in sales to help do that. My background is as a venture partner in Amplify Partners. We invest in early stage enterprise funds, or enterprise companies. For me, this is a super personal topic. I spend my time working with our portfolio companies trying to figure out how to navigate this very topic. So I was talking to folks in the audience, and a lot of people are here because they're fanboys of this group of people right here up on the stage. I mean,
or fangirls.
Fanboys, fangirls, thank you. So initially the plan was to give the standard bio, which you can, if you want to watch it online, you can catch that. I thought, what can we tell people about these people that they don't know already, since there's so much out there? So I thought, let's get them to answer a question you've probably never been asked before. What is your spirit animal? Edith.
Puma.
There we go.
Might be my personal house cat, honestly, or maybe it's my life goal.
My Puma will run with your house cat.
They'll nap together.
Nicholas.
Indeed, never got that question. Bear? Maybe teddy bear?
Teddy bear. Okay. We may come back to that later in the discussion. All right. So I thought a great place to start the discussion this evening is on the question of what made you realize, what was the catalyst for you to decide it's time to transition away from you as a founder being the person on point to lead sales? Edith, why don't you kick us off with that?
So I think the first thing is that as a founder, you have to sell. So I was on the other side of this audience. I was a Heavybit member, and I remember Nicholas coming about 3 years ago and giving a presentation on selling, and it was so impactful to me. And every time I see him, I tell him that, and he's like very modest. He's like, thank you. But
Yeah, well.
I saw a lot of founders I know trying to skip that founder step.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, let me just hire a salesperson and they'll go out and sell.
Yeah.
You can't skip that step.
Yeah.
If you as the founder are not comfortable talking with customers, if you're not comfortable with what your value proposition is, if you're not comfortable about giving a price, you don't have anything to transition.
Yeah.
So the most important thing about transitioning off of founder sales is that there's a founder selling.
That's great. That's great. Nicholas, what about you? Think back to the transitions you went through in bringing on initial salespeople.
Like 3 years ago, before speaking to this. No, actually, in our case, it's slightly unusual because our second hire became later our VP sales. So very early on, we were two technical co-founders, so we knew that we didn't know enough. So in a way, after hiring our first technical hire, we quickly looked for someone to help us with business. And so that was Gaetan, who was more like a biz dev guy than a pure sales guy. At that time, we were simply trying to figure it out. And so it was kind of like more a group thinking thing. We were all selling, but we had that first business background person joining us.
Yeah. So it wasn't what you would call kind of a traditional enterprise salesperson.
No, he was more a BD guy, so he actually had led an SDR team before.
Yeah.
So it was, trying to figure out how to get in touch with customers, how to convince them. Like it was like all over the world. It was very entrepreneurial kind of activity. Yeah. But he had that business background that really helped us navigate through that.
Yeah. And perhaps, if you don't mind, fast forward to the VP of sales hire, and what was the catalyst for bringing on sales leadership?
So fast forward a few years, so he joined us in 2013, end of 2013. By mid-15, we were around, I don't know, like 2.5, 3 million ARR, and we thought, discussing with our board, that we should hire a real VP sales. And so we started a search then. That's when we met the first time. It took us like maybe 10 months. We nearly hired 2 people. At the end of the process, every single person I was meeting was not as good as Gaetan. So in the 10 months, because of course he was very involved in the process, we both learned so much from interviewing all these candidates that by then, of course he was still very stretched for the role, but I was convinced he could do it himself. So we promoted him VP Sales, and from there on he's still with us, still leading the team.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love the internal promotion from within.
We've been super lucky. I'm not going to tell you do that, because that's we were extremely lucky to have someone who could grow with the needs of the company, which is pretty rare.
Yeah. Armand, talk to us about how you all thought about the profile of the first set of sales hires you brought on board, please.
Yeah, for sure. I think, the nature of kind of the tools that we sell tend to be pretty much hyper technical. And so I think, our biggest concern was, could we bring in salespeople that really would be able to kind of articulate the value proposition without, instantly needing to bring in sort of a sales engineer on the first meeting. And so I think what we sort of overly maybe sort of focused on was, let's look at people who come from sort of distributed database background, infrastructure background, sort of, understand more of kind of the problem domain we're in so that they'll be able to articulate the problem. So the first few folks we hired were really out of looking at other sort of similar type companies, distributed systems type things, so that they could kind of help articulate, a relatively complex value proposition.
And what'd you learn from that? Was that the right choice in your mind?
I think, the mistake we made was we hired salespeople, I think, too early. I think ours was not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily that we had a clear, repeatable process and now we need to scale this up. It was more, okay, maybe we should have salespeople for no real clear reason, right? Our board was like, should you have them? And we're like, I don't know, should we? Let's go hire them. And so I think we made the mistake of actually hiring salespeople before we really knew who our customer was or what our product even was. So I think we sort of dropped folks into the field and we're like, go sell to somebody. And they're like, what are we selling? We're like, we don't know. We also don't know to who you're selling, but good luck. God be with you.
Yeah. Edith, go ahead, finish the thought.
No, I think that was, I think a bit of our mistake was, what we looked for was, technical, or ability to sort of operate in a sort of technical domain, but I think we just brought folks on too early in an environment where they couldn't have been successful.
Yeah. Edith, you're nodding. What did you take away from that, and what advice do you have for people trying to figure out, is it too early or too late to hire a salesperson?
Well, exactly what Armand said is like the founders have to know who they're selling to, the qualifying questions. Like my co-founder John Kodomel and I would go out and I would AE and he would SE.
Right.
And we would just get this rhythm and like we would just look at each other and we're like, okay, this is not a good sale, let's leave. And you have to have that so that you can pass that on to somebody. You can't fake that.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I think that was one of our biggest mistakes, was sort of too early.
Yep.
Yeah, and then you could also be too late. Something that we learned is that the Bay Area is really hard to hire in.
Yeah.
And a good salesperson wants to come in where you have some sort of pipeline and repeatable process, or any good salesperson.
Yeah.
So there's this, we started looking, it took us a while to find somebody, and now that we are a year and a half later, like we can hire AEs at a good clip because we could say like, here's our pipe, here's our playbook.
Right.
You're going to make this commission.
Right.
But the first salespeople are really hard to convince.
Right.
Awesome. Nicholas, what would you add to that?
I mean, we did fail too with our first.
That's you.
I mean, that was what I was sharing 3 years ago. So our first hire was a big mistake. I think the biggest thing we could have done better would have been to hire two. So it would have been easier to compare.
But even one is hard to find.
But one is hard to find. I don't know if it was hard or if we just simply didn't know what we were doing. And at first, we didn't hire any pure salespeople. And that was good and bad. I mean, the first two hires, my first hire was not a salespeople. She was an SE, actually. And she didn't work out at all. The second one was a consultant, and he's today our head of EMEA sales. It really turned out great because we were still figuring it out. And so that consultant background helped so much, especially with big accounts. So you never know. I mean, the first few hires are like so difficult.
Yeah, I'd love to get perspective. I know a lot of founders think of the idea. You said, I think it was you that said, hey, I was the AE and my co-founder was the SE. To a lot of the founders, of course, the idea of being a salesperson is not only foreign, it's repulsive at some level.
Try some of that.
Perhaps share a bit about your perspective before having done it and after having done it, and any practical perspective or advice you would have on how to master that set of capabilities.
Well, the joke is I started off in engineering, and I literally remember saying to my coworkers, like, I hate these salespeople. And like every so often that quote haunts me. I think the thing you have to realize as a founder is that feedback from prospects is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about you, at the really early stage, it's not about you convincing them to buy something. It's you hearing what they're saying.
Yep.
And taking that back to your product team, even if the product team is just your co-founder, who's sitting next to you and be like, hey, these big dreams we had about building this, people actually want this.
Yeah.
And that is the gift you get from doing the sales calls yourself.
And I think that's extra critical when you haven't yet achieved product market fit. And I think that's to a degree where I felt like we hired too early is I don't think we had that product market fit. So here is a product that the market doesn't want, go sell it. And some of that gets lost in translation versus when you're there and the feedback of the prospects right in front of you being like, so what problem does this solve? And you're like, okay, maybe we have a problem here.
Yeah, because it's so easy to delude yourself when you're sitting alone in the co-working space with your co-founder. Like, everybody's gonna love this. You go on site, they're like,
yeah.
That's it shouldn't change.
what?
It shouldn't change. I mean, as you grow and get some salespeople, you still want to be in front of the customers.
Yeah.
So that's a sometimes difficult part, but you still want that feedback, still want to have that direct contact with the customers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So forever, many of these types of talks are focused on the salesperson, where in practice, if you can only have one, a salesperson or a pre-salesperson, a technical salesperson, an SE, a solution architect, they go by different names. Many folks would probably take the latter. Even as we were prepping, shame on me, I had thought about them as had not thought about them inclusive in the concept. Armand, to his credit, corrected me and said, hey, we should be thinking about this as part of one of the key decisions that you have to think about in that transition too, because many of you and your co-founders are the SE, the solution architect. Armand, talk about how you all thought about when, what profile, how to go about finding that person.
Yeah, I think for us, we actually hired our first SE, 10 employees before we hired our first salesperson. So for us, the SE was actually much earlier, and I think, to Edith's point, I think in the beginning, I was comfortable being the sort of the AE and being the salesperson, but the nature of kind of what we were selling was, tended to be pretty complicated infrastructure tooling, and so it was always SE heavy. And so although I could drop in and spend an hour with the customer, I couldn't then for every customer spend a whole day trying to figure out, okay, let me get the sort of configuration right for their environment. So it became clear that we needed an SE help before we actually needed the sales team help. And for us, and I think what's continued to be true is sort of hiring practitioners. I think we found it's much easier to take a engineer and train them how to be a sales engineer than to take someone who has a sales background and train them to be an engineer. That tends to be a lot harder. And so I think that's where we've sort of found our most successes. Find the people who at least like our domain or, ideally are familiar with our tools and sort of train them on the sales side of it.
Our first SE was actually the customer support manager at one of our customers. And he says, I love being in sales because he came out of support. He's like, I get to see the hopes and dreams.
Not the reality afterwards.
That's a good way to put it.
That's great. I just want to underline that point. Some of the very, very best SEs that I've had the chance to work with and seen in portfolio companies are, in fact, former customers. They not only understand the product, they understand the environment it's going into, and they can speak from a place of personal experience with the marriage of those two things. Nicholas, any perspective from you? Who was your first SE or technical sales hire?
Same thing. He joined us before the first salespeople. I mean, out of my first leader. And he was not really SE at first. He was SE, CSM, developer advocate. It was everything. He was going on all the events. It was marketing. It was like, it's the most I don't know, like that's a role in the early days. They are going to do everything,
Yeah.
and with time, of course, we specialized the role. But then, yeah, and then for every complex project, it would be my co-founder, it would be me, and I think even today, I still see myself as more like when I, we can speak after about the role of the founder evolving, but I still see myself as an SE in some
Right.
deals.
Yeah.
Because technical co-founder, it happens that you are going to know your product sometimes even better than your SEs, not in the same depth, or maybe not
Yeah.
going to be able to build a POC,
Yeah.
but you can speak about the product with a lot of conviction.
Yeah.
You're the
And
SE
so-
of last resort.
Yeah, not the sort of last result. That's a good image.
Every now and then I get to give a demo. I'm like, yes.
Yeah, I still regret I don't do
Yeah.
that many demos, and kind of
Yeah.
like actually I should do more.
Yeah. So I'm going to guess, I'm going to put you three on the spot. I'm going to guess you're all three perfectionists to a degree. Shared experience or learning of handing over the reins, so to speak, to one of these SEs, and how you navigated the fact that they did it a little differently, or in a way that perhaps wasn't the way you would have done it, and how you thought about that. Did you view that as a chance to align them with what you saw as the right way to do it, or was it an opportunity to learn and do different? I don't want to put you on the spot there.
I think the thing that comes to mind is I remember, early customer, early day, this goes to having salespeople too early. We sold products that shouldn't have existed and didn't exist. And I remember we sold to a company in Australia, and they were like, okay, well, along with the product, we also want you to come on site and do training. And I think, like you said, the SEs were, in the early days, you do everything. So it's like, great, we need you to put together like a 2-day training workshop for this customer. And I remember we fly all the way to Australia, right? A 17-hour flight. You get there. It's like the next day we're doing a 2-day training. And I'm like, let's look at the training material. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, oh boy, we got some issues here. And I remember the two of us basically just stayed up for we were up till like 3 in the morning before we went on site with the customer at like 8 a.m. the next day to start 2 days of training with them. And it all went to shit. The whole thing was a disaster because we made the assumption that the people in the training would be able to do it interactively with us by using sort of a virtual machine on their laptop. We get on site and they're like, corporate policy is no VMs on laptops. We're like, oh, okay, this is going to be an interesting training session. So it turned into just sort of us running the training on our laptop, projecting it, and other people watching. And the whole thing, the format was wrong, content was wrong. And I think the kind of learning, there was a lot of learning lessons in it for both of us, which is, I think, I think we had an unfairly high standard for the SC. At the beginning, you say, hey, your job is everything. And I think we sort of, we maybe asked too much of the early people sometimes. But then on the other side, it told us like, okay, actually, maybe we should sort of build out training as a competency and not just wing it the night before.
Yeah. I love, this is a good transition into onboarding. So congratulations, you found these unicorns, these salespeople and really highly talented SEs. Next step is how do you get them on board and get them productive? Edith, maybe if you don't mind sharing the journey you went through and how you do that. Maybe we even start with the SE. Let's give the SEs credit because they're in some ways probably harder to get ramped up.
Well, we got our first AEs, and it's very reflective because it was when we were still in Heavybit.
Yeah, okay.
So back then, it was very much by osmosis.
Yeah.
So we hired our first AE when he made us an 8-person team.
Yeah.
And what I told the team is he needs to be embedded. It's not the sales team over there and us over here. He is our ears to the ground. So we ate lunch together every day. We would run down and make sure that we had a big enough table for 8 people. And we would do a daily stand-up with 8 people.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of you are part of us. The onboarding is just you're not part of us. When we started scaling up and doing cohorts, we had to get a lot more systematic. So now we have our VP sales' entire plan.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, you need to do it based on the stage you're at.
Yeah.
And not think there's a cookie cutter where you have everything figured out at the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. Nicholas, talk about your early experiences with onboarding, sales, and SE. And I'd love you to pick out if there's one example of something that you kind of figured out a couple of reps later into the process. You're like, oh, geez, we should have been doing that from the beginning. Share an example of that, please, too.
Okay. I think one of the things, so when you start, it was the same thing as with the SE. Sales, there is also a lot of roles, like from the SDR, qualification, and then SMB, mid-market, enterprise. It's all different motions. In the beginning, you ask them to do everything. You even ask them to do marketing because they don't have any collaterals, they don't have any playbooks, they don't have anything. So I think in the early days, yeah, that's a bit tough. So they basically learn because you come with them on the deal, you go on the call with them, and they learn from you. And after hearing you saying something 10 times, they know they can say it. And so what happened after, when we started to have like a bit more maturity, of course we would first design more of a, let's say, a team structure by dividing the team. We started to have like BDRs. Oh, can we test some kind of outbound there? Is there something that can work? Well, it didn't in the early days, but that first rep worked pretty well, very smart, and then started the very first minimal playbooks there that helped the next one to be more successful and the next one to be more successful. It's really iterative. Even like, I don't know for you, but you don't hire a VP sales and they are going to build the playbook and that's it. It's more like iteration after iteration, rep after rep. Everyone is contributing, and after a certain time, you get your VP sales and they are consolidating and creating the next stage in a way.
Our background is engineering, so I was VP sales. We ran it like an engineering org, and that we did a monthly retrospective. So every month we say what went well, what could we improve on, and it's not a blame game of like this. It's just like, hey, how can we make the playbook be a little bit better next month?
So we didn't have that process in place, but that's basically the idea. It's really to constantly look back, what worked, what didn't, learn from it, and create the playbook as you go. Yeah,
like and the playbook is always changing also.
Even today, of course. Positioning is changing, the product is changing, you expand in new markets, the culture of the countries you are going after is changing. Everything is different. So you need to, the difference is that today, at some scale, you start to have territories, and so you specialize your salespeople, so they don't need to know everything anymore.
Right.
But
Armand, talk a bit about, please, the evolution at Hoshi from the very first reps, how you onboarded them, and then how that changed over time, please.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the mistake I think we made of hiring too early. Is that we didn't necessarily have them figure out the playbook. We had them figure out what we should be selling. We had them be our product marketing team in some sense, which was like, why don't you just go pitch these like 10 different ideas and see which ones resonate? Like figure out what the customer wants to buy, and then we'll see how quickly we can build it for them. And I think, in some sense, I think that was probably a little unusual to drop salespeople into that position of being like, hey, go tell us what we should be selling. And so I think that was a mistake for sure, and I think speaks to like make sure you at least understand what your product is before you hire salespeople. I think what sort of changed for us after we brought in a VP of sales and had a better idea of what is the product, who is the customer, is then we built out a much more formal boot camp, right? Of okay, you come in, we need to, there's a whiteboard pitch that you have to be able to give before you're certified. You have to be able to talk about the product domain. You have to be able to talk sort of 100,000-foot view of each of our products, and then go through and articulate what's the value proposition of these things, on sort of a whiteboard. So I think we sort of formalize it a lot more, but it started with at least just understanding ourselves, like what the product was.
Yeah. So I'd love to transition to the last topic before we move to the audience Q&A. So in a sense, in the same way this is a transition for the company, it's a transition for your individual roles. It's, in some sense, you change both how you spend your time day to day, and then also the way in which you understand your business. Your ability to connect directly with the customers changes. Your ability to understand opportunities and where they stand and where the business is going to end up at the end of the quarter also changes in a way too. Nicholas, I'll toss this one to you first. Talk about how your role has evolved as you've transitioned away from being in the middle of the sales process day to day.
Yeah, so in a way, at some point, you become what you would call an exec sponsor. So it's funny how it works. I'm going to say the exact same thing as my sales people. And because it comes from the CEO, it doesn't have the same impact. And so use that, leverage with customers, because of course, if it comes from the founders and the CEO, the credibility is going to be way higher. And so I just act as a support function for the sales. Like for the big deals, I'm going to get on a call and tell the customers probably exactly the same things they were already saying, but they are going to hear something else. So it's more support. Then of course, if I can introduce the right people through investors, like it's kind of like trying to support them in everything they do. Sometimes they would even send me some email templates to send from my email, so that it comes from me. They prepare it, they draft it for me. I change 1 or 2 words because that's not me, just to make it mine. And then I send it, and sometimes that changes everything. That accelerates a deal. You get an answer where they were trying to get an answer for 10 days and didn't get anything, and so on.
Talk a bit about collaboration and communication. So that the team gets bigger, you now have a layer effectively between the customer and the company. How do you ensure that the communication flow is really healthy?
Yeah, so one of the key things we do here, I mean, there is 2 sides. There is me and the team. So at the team level, what we do is actually a monthly retrospective. Let's call that this way, but more like we call that a review, where every customer-facing team members are invited, and that is open to all the company. And during that 1-hour meeting every month, we go over all the sales metrics, marketing metrics, CSM, SE, like all the customer-facing team are represented and share all their learnings. At the more personal level, there is one thing I've just started to do. I've done it twice only today, is really to organize, we call that roundtables. So as a founder, as a CEO, or other roles, you get in the room with one, like individual contributors of one function. Here that would be sales. Get like 8-10 people in the room, and you're just there to ask 2 questions. What's the thing that is working the best? What is the thing that is working the worst in your mind? And you get the discussion going. You're just there to listen. You engage them, and then of course you learn from them and try to change things for the better. But that's also a very good way to keep in touch with what's actually happening in the field.
Yeah. Armand, I'd love to hear a bit from you about how, as you brought on this layer between the customer and headquarters, how you thought about ensuring good collaboration and communication.
Yeah, and I think it sort of evolved at different sort of stages of the business, right? I think in the early days before we had sales management, the sales team reported to me directly. And so even when we brought in a VP of sales, I sort of kept that, right? And so I still had this sort of dotted line, one-on-one with all the salespeople to really just get sort of that unfiltered, unaggregated feedback of what's working, what's resonating, what's not working. And so even as the sales team got bigger, the first few salespeople, I'd still meet with them on a regular cadence just to understand sort of what's happening in the field. And then as we got a little bigger, we switched to what we called kind of go-to-market meetings, which is similar, I think, to the way you described of sort of all the customer-facing groups, where it's customer success, it's support, it's the sales engineers and sales teams sort of getting together and saying what's working, what's not working. And so then I'd sort of fly in the wall there to say, okay, what are we seeing sort of in terms of what's working, what's not working? And honestly, I still, to this day, spend 25% of my time in the field, right? So I probably, 1 out of 4 weeks, I'm on the road in front of customers, both prospects and existing customers. So I hear I hear when it's still hopes and dreams and they're a prospect, and then I hear, the reality, after they bought. And I think that's still, in some sense, honestly, the most critical feedback, because it's like there is something that just gets lost in translation no matter what, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's filtered through an SE or a salesperson, and by the time it goes through all the right committees and aggregations, it's not the same thing as when you're right there in front of the customer and you're like, okay, that really needs to be our #1 priority, right?
Yeah.
And you can't do it if you only go to 1 or 2 meetings, right? You have to go to it enough that the dots form, and all of a sudden you're connecting the dots saying, oh yeah, this is a product gap for us. So I still find it super valuable and incredibly time consuming to be in the field.
That's great. So why don't we move to Q&A from the audience?
I have a really easy answer. It was when I became the bottleneck, because people would be, where's my order form? you know, I'm ready to sign, and I would have to type up the order forms, and I was the backlog. I mean, that is a really obvious one where it's like people want to give you money, and they're like, come on, give me the order form.
Yeah, I think probably it was maybe a little different. I don't know how much time you had to talk to customers before they sent you the order form. We had to spend a little more time talking, but I think for us the bottleneck, it was similar sort of thing. Is like when the bottleneck was like, I can't take all these meetings with potential customers. Like there has to be other people triaging and taking sort of level 1, level 2 meetings, and that I think was but as long as time allowed to take it, I think there's still valuable information you can mine there that you should mine until there's no time left in the day, basically.
I'll add on that it will take you longer to hire a salesperson than you think.
Yes.
Yes, and if you fail, you have to start from the beginning.
Yeah, the reset cycle's long.
You need to suffer first, but then hire two.
I'm interested, so you two answered the question from the perspective of kind of time and resource, your resource, which makes a ton of sense. I'm interested if either, as you thought about what you hoped to get out of a salesperson or what you in retrospect realized you did, if it was also a set of skills that were pretty clearly not ones that you three had, and what that skill or capability was. Maybe Nicholas, I'll point you on the spot for that one.
You know, when we hired our first sales rep, they didn't have a quota. We didn't know what should be the quota. So it's kind of, what do you expect? I mean, we expect to figure it out with you.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that's not going to be the traditional people that are going to join, because you cannot ensure anything, but you still want to keep some kind of, commission-based kind of structure. So for the first couple of ones, that was pretty tough because we didn't know. And then it took us a few months of history to be able to figure out what could be the first quota.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was kind of like, I think that was the most difficult early thing.
Yeah, and I think to maybe just add to that, I think there's the sort of skill gap I think you're mentioning. But I think to Edith's point, I think you must build that skill, right? And as much as you hate it, right? Like there was nothing that pained me more than asking a customer for money.
But you have to.
But you have to. You have to build that muscle.
You look at your AWS bill and you're like...
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't pay itself. If only we could pay developers and GitHub stars, it'd be fine.
Did you get better at that?
What?
Did you get better at asking for money?
No, actually. My salespeople refused to let me be in the room for that.
I got much better. The joke is I didn't have to pay myself commission. I don't think you could do that at the super early stage. I think for us, the one thing we really screened for, and we got this from Nicholas, again, I'll give you credit, was we were engineers. We're like, would we buy from this person?
Yes.
That was something you taught us.
Yes, actually, we did hire only one salesperson that was a car salesman. And still with us. Car salesman.
Okay. Used or new?
New. Okay. And the guy was so motivated. I still remember doing the interview. We do a founder call during the process, and he was taking the call from the back of a car in the concession, hiding from colleagues and so on.
Yeah.
Very impressive call. He struggled a lot. He struggled a lot in the beginning because everything was so different. It's a completely different world. So I'm not sure it's setting them up for success.
Yeah.
It's tough. So yes, you can have. It's easier, I would say, for an engineer to become a salesperson, if you are selling a tech product, of course, than for someone who is in sales but don't sell tech or software to then start selling software. It could be even more difficult.
I more meant that you have to have a lot of empathy for your customers.
Mm-hmm.
Like whenever a best salesperson did not have a traditional software background, and we get thank you notes about him. Mm-hmm. But he has a lot of empathy and understanding. It's not...
Yeah, and I also don't necessarily think that all salespeople who are in tech are necessarily the right salespeople for you, right? And I think we found this out that even within sort of the tech sector, you'll see there's sort of folks that they've built their career selling to a CIO, and you drop them into a room of developers and they are a fish out of water. They're like, who's the buyer here? Why am I even here? I don't want to talk to these people, right? And we hired a sales guy, he literally said, he's like, I never want to talk to a developer. And you're like, do you know who buys our stuff? like you're not going to make it very far here. And he struggled, right? Because it's like, when you're used to that top-down sales motion, the notion of you're going to build a a bottom-up sort of groundswell of support and kind of move up the tree is foreign to them. They're like, that seems like a lot of work. I'm just going to call up, my buddy and go to golf, right? And I think so even then you have to look for the salespeople that kind of are used to the motion that's necessary for your product. And maybe your product is sold top-down, right?
So I'll do just a quick primer. So SDR is typically their entry-level sales professionals, couple years out of college. Oftentimes their job is outbound cold calling, outbound work to develop leads. And then those are in turn fed to your account executives. And hopefully, with success, these people in turn become your account executive team. So great question. Nicholas, I'll put it to you first, please.
It took us a few steps. So we started by splitting AEs between SMB and like mid-market enterprise. And so SMB AEs were kind of like dealing with all the inbound calls from small startups. And progressively that function transitioned to SDR. It's really when it became clear that we were spending too much time on that, it started to make sense to have like a specialized function there. And it's indeed a very good training function. People start there, become SMBAs and then mid-market and continue to evolve. And that's a very, very good starting point because they are going to be exposed to so many use cases, so many different customers. It's very high velocity. A big part of their work is actually doing support. Yes, sales-led support, but they get to know the product so much better so that when they are trained, they do a much better job.
Yeah. Edith, do you all use SDRs?
It's funny that the joke is that I was the original SDR. I agree with Nicholas. I think SDRs, you need to, if they're outbound, you need to have a certain amount of awareness of even what you do. So we tried doing outbound very early.
So we did that later. So what I didn't say is that we have two types of SDRs, inbound and outbound. I was mostly speaking of inbound, but we also have outbound SDRs, and that we really invested there way later. Like we were already at 10 million or something when we started really outbound. And it was more experimental. We got one person paired him with an AE and then started and then it worked. And so we scaled from there.
Yep.
Armand?
I think, we kind of went through the specialization process as well, where originally everyone was sort of just an account executive and then eventually did the sort of similar split of sort of enterprise account executive and sort of SMB mid-market. And then the sort of SMB mid-market then kind of split again into sort of the well-qualified SMB mid-market and the sort of SDR/inside sales team. And so it's sort of still today a hybrid function. We don't have sort of dedicated SDRs. It's both sort of SMB inside and sort of SDR kind of rolled into one.
Do you do outbound?
Very little. Yeah, very little.
I got very good at this very quickly. So we do, LaunchDarkly helps you if you're releasing basically once a month or so and you want to start doing feature flag management. So I would ask people like, how often do you release? How often do you want to release? And like I literally remember once, like it was when we were training and we had just hired our first AE and we went into a meeting and the person said we release every 6 months, we don't release more. And I'm like, let's get up and leave. I think you get really good at qualifying when you realize how expensive it is to spend time with somebody who's not going to buy.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. I think we suffer from the problem. We sort of joke internally that we're kind of 4 companies in one because the products are sort of so different in terms of who we sell to. So I think for each of the products has sort of been independently developing like what their persona actually is. And I think some of them are easier to qualify than others, right? I think, for us, it's almost a similar thing, which is, how often do you deploy? And if the answer is every 6 months, it's also like...
Well, and how often do you want to?
Right, exactly. Yeah, if you want to deploy more, that's a different question.
Then we can help you.
Right, and it's like, do you want to go to a cloud, one or many? And if the answer is no, we're pretty happy in our private data center, it's like, okay, great, we're out of here. So I think there's a few of these questions that and honestly, you kind of know those even as when you're doing founder-led sales. By the time you're that early, you kind of know those questions. Like at that stage, it doesn't take very long. I think even before you hire kind of the first few people, you kind of know what the qualifications are.
And then you start to pass them on to your AEs. Like this is really fun. Like we had something we called it Brain Trust, where we would all sit around there, and we would rate deals on the meter.
Right.
Like we were like, how likely are they to buy? And,
Right.
And we would just get really good at it. It's like, okay, here's warning signs, like own data center.
Bad sign. Yeah.
Like Nick,
Yeah, no, we were not qualifying early in the beginning. Any opportunity was a good one for us in the beginning. That means that sometimes you would spend 4 hours on a call for a $50 deal. But it didn't really matter because we were learning. And then it started I mean, for us it was easy because in a way it's all based on the volume and the size of the website, so we can guess the potential right away from looking at their stats that are public. So that's easier. And then later on, like today, they put in place, they call that MedPeak, kind of like specific approach. Maybe you know that, but like how to qualify, like urgency and all the criteria and so on.
Yeah.
So of course it became way more mature. But in the early days, yeah, I mean, nothing, basically no qualification. Any good opportunity was a good one to follow. Everyone needs search. So you need search. Of course, we are the best one. That said, no, there were quite a few use cases we were not the best product for, and that we would disqualify right away, just to avoid spending time on that. So that's a small.
yeah, and it's funny because we test those assumptions, like because somebody new will come in and they're like, can we try to sell that persona, and they'll do a couple calls and they'll be like, this is a bad persona. I'm like,
I think it changes as well over time, right?
Yeah.
As the product changes, right?
Yeah.
Like you add new capabilities and all of a sudden it's like a persona that you couldn't talk to before. Now they're sort of in scope or market landscape changes. So I think it's not you figure it out one time and then you're done. It's a moving target, right? And it evolves with the market and the product and the maturity of the company.
And that can hurt you because in the beginning, because you want to qualify, you are going to say, we are great for that and only that. And then 2 years later, people still remember you for that.
Right.
Of course, you have expanded and you need to fight back. Hey, we do much more now.
Yep.
yeah.
So you need to be careful on this one.
Yeah.
We were really explicit about it. I had been at big enterprise companies where the salespeople were, the people over there that the engineers, which I always hated. And I just told the team up front, like, because we were a small startup, I'm like, if this is going to work, this is our buddy. And like even now, like we make a conscious effort of like, we are not going to have salespeople not talk to engineers. Like we'll assign them a buddy. We try to mix it up, and like you can't at an early stage say salespeople over there are selling your building, because then you have no feedback loop, and it's.
So you got one advantage if you sell to developers, because they are going to need the knowledge, the expertise from the developers.
Yeah.
So it's a very good incentive for them.
Yeah.
But of course, you need to be very deliberate at making sure your team collaborates and work together.
Yeah.
Get them around the same table. At the end of the day, one of the things I really love, I'm the proudest of, is to see engineers getting on sales call and loving it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not wanting, but they want to help, and they contribute to the success of the company that way.
Yeah. And I think there's a really important sort of founder narrative when you start hiring, which is you can't establish the narrative that it's like engineering is the sort of first-class citizen, and we're gonna build a wall and put some salespeople on the other side of it. And I think, to Edith's point, we had that very explicit conversation with the whole company before we started hiring. That's like, remember, the salespeople pay your salary, right? So be nice to them, right? And I think there was a very conscious effort to sort of tear down the wall and make sure they're part of our stand-up, they're part of all of our all-hands, that there is this cultural sort of meshing of the groups. And I think we'd all be, I'm sure the experience is, I think, shared, that there is a different sales culture, right? And I think you have to be prepared for that, right? Particularly enterprise sales is its own beast. And I think the message that we had to the company was like, this is not a bad thing, right? But the culture of the company will evolve over time, right? As you bring in different people with different backgrounds and personas, the culture evolves and changes, but it's for the best, right? Because what the salespeople will bring more than any other group is an incredible sense of urgency for what the customer problem is, right? And it is, alarm bells are going off. It's like, unless we have this feature, this deal will not close, right? And on one side, that can be stressful for an engineering team. It's like, no, we want to architect the perfect, ideal platonic system, right, without the constraints of time and the customer's problem. But no business has that real luxury, right? And so in some sense, you want that healthy tension of the sales team that's sort of actively pushing on product management and engineering that go faster, we need this thing, the customer wants this, or here's the gaps, because they actually have a much tighter feedback loop than anyone in engineering.
Yeah, sales is the gift of feedback.
Yeah, it is. Right.
Like if you don't have any customers, you're just building your pipe dream.
Right. You're just having fun. It's
Yeah.
a side project.
It's a hobby.
Okay.
I'll tell you the #1 red flag. Always check references. So it was somebody who had come down from Seattle, and it is really hard to hire your first salesperson. So we were really excited about him. We really liked him. I asked him for references. He gave me an architect in Denver and an insurance salesperson in San Diego, and I was just like, no, I wanted professional references. And he's like, I don't really keep in touch with people. I'm like, but you're a salesperson.
Right.
That would be a bright red flag.
Yeah,
That seems problematic.
yeah, like always check references. I am amazed at how many startup founders don't,
Yeah.
and it just boggles my mind.
And don't expect, check references. My first sales hire, I did check references and still hired her, where, of course, in retrospect, you guess, of course, I should have known better.
Well,
and so when you go on a reference call, go in a way, put yourself in a mindset you want to find what's wrong. You just don't want confirmation of what you already believe.
Yeah, I asked what
That's
environment would this person do well in?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very telling question of so because sometimes they need a really structured environment, they need this, and I'm like,
Yeah, I think a salesperson actually can be really hard, I found, because in some sense that, they're trained at selling, and that includes selling themselves. So they can sometimes be a little harder to gauge. Where in SE, I think actually the red flags come out a lot quicker, which is, let them sort of explain to you the value proposition of anything that they care about, right? Like pick your favorite tool, technology, whatever problem you've worked on, right? And have them try and sort of articulate that to you, because in some sense that is their full-time job, is can you take a complex problem domain and articulate it to someone else, right? And if they can't do that succinctly, or they do it in a way that's so excruciatingly boring that you're already checking Twitter 2 minutes in, right? It's a bad sign, because guess what they're going to be doing in front of a customer, right? And so I found the SEs are actually a lot easier that way, that if they have a hard time communicating, that's really, really hard to teach. Teaching them the organization and some of the sales process and some of the things to say, that's easy, but teaching someone to be a good communicator is really hard, right? And I think screening for that is, screen the SEs for technical skill, that's usually pretty straightforward, but then communication skill, which is much, much harder to teach.
Edith already mentioned it before, but would you buy from them?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That one is critical. You are tech.
That's great.
If your guts tell you something is wrong, you want to buy a car, something is wrong, your customers are going to feel the same thing.
Yeah.
So be careful. Trust your guts, especially in the first few ones.
Yeah.
Just the sense of pride you feel when the team is executing. There's no better feeling in the world when the team closes a deal and they brought you in maybe for one call, and you're like, wow, this is a working business.
Yeah.
It's not just it's not just a 2-person show. This is a going concern.
Yeah.
That is really it's I think it's, if you're an engineer, realize that you're also building a sales team.
Right. Armand.
I think it was really building a sense of partnership with the VP of sales, so that it's not just, we've hired you, you deal with sales, I never think about it again, it's on the other side of the wall. I think you really, really want that to be, it's an integral part of how the business functions, and I think building that relationship, building that trust, so that it's you feel like you really can be honest with the VP of sales and vice versa, in terms of because you're always going to get the alarm bells of everything needs to be done right now, everything's on fire, right? But what are the things that really, really need to be done? What are the things that really, really matter? And being able to build that sort of rapport and trust, so that you can sort of have that communication flow, and not have sales be sort of, I hired the VP of sales, that's a checkbox, I'm done, I don't think about it anymore.
Closing our first big deals, whatever the number of zeros, that you really didn't think before that you could do as a company, as a product, like first enterprise deals or like these kind of things. That's crazy for you, like so much money. Of course, after some time, it becomes okay. But the first one, it's when you really see that there is a sales, like sales are bringing way more than just helping you close, like sign small things. When you realize that they bring expertise that has a concrete value in the type of deal you can close.
I jokingly nicknamed our VP of Sales the multiplier, because any deal that I would sell for some amount, he would multiply. And I'm always like, how does the superpower work? It's like everything just gets bigger when you're here.
I still have the biggest deal, and I challenge the team. I'm like, take that biggest deal away from me.
Edith, Armand, Nicholas, it's been amazing. Thank you. Your perspective has been fantastic. Let's give them a round of applause, everyone.